Thank you. It's really good to be here with you this evening. So I work for a charity called Home for Good. I'm the chief executive, if I'm still figuring out what that actually means. So each year, 35,000 children are taken into care. They're removed from homes where they're experiencing neglect and abuse, or for whatever other reason their birth parents can't take care for them. When they come into care, they need fostering, either short-term, while problems are addressed at home so they can go back. Some of them will need to go into long-term foster care. Some of them will need to go on to be adopted into a new forever family. As a result of this huge number of children coming into care each year, there is a crisis in the care system in the UK. And at the moment, there's a shortfall of about 7,000 foster carers. And there are thousands of children who are waiting way too long to be adopted because no one wants that type of child. These children tend to be teenagers, children with additional needs, children that are part of a sibling group, and children from black minority ethnic backgrounds. A social worker in London told me a few years ago that if a black boy reaches the age of 4 in the care system, there's a 2% chance that he'll go on to be adopted. And we just don't think that's right. We just don't think that is fair at all. Life outcomes for children who bounce around the care system are not good. Each year, 9,000 young people will age out of the care system. A quarter of the adult prison population are care leavers. 50% of the prison population under the age of 21 are care leavers. A third of homeless people are care leavers. A third of sex workers are care leavers. And the statistics go on. One of the most shocking ones I ever heard is a care leaver is 20 times more likely to be dead by the age of 25 than anyone else. That's a Scottish statistic there. So the outcomes for care leavers are not good. And a few years ago, a group of Christian leaders were at a Christian festival, and they were just talking to one another as the crisis in the care system was hitting the headlines for the first time in quite a while. And they all recognised that they were either foster carers or adopters. And at the time, there was 8,000 more foster carers needed and 4,000 children waiting to be adopted. And they kind of just did the maths between them, that between them, their organisations were in contact with 12,000 churches. So they did the maths. If one family from each church chose to step up to foster and adopt, there would be no more children waiting for a home in the care system. But they also realised that fostering and adoption is not for everyone. In fact, they are only suggesting that one family in each of those churches stepped up to foster and adopt. But churches provide an amazing community of support to wrap around the families that do choose to foster and adopt, because it's hard to foster and adopt. You're not tending to adopt a beautiful 0-month-old baby with no issues. So it is challenging. So out of that, eventually, Home for Good was born to inspire Christians to think about fostering or adopting, and to wrap around or encourage churches to wrap around and support families that foster and adopt. So let me just tell you a few stories to kind of inspire you. One of the things we're about is we're trying to change the narrative around fostering and adoption. So we're trying to kind of push the boundary on who thinks about fostering or adopting. So we're delighted in 2014, after our Adoption Sunday services, that we ran information events up and down the country for people thinking about fostering and adopting. They are attended by about 200 people, and 100 of people, so 50% of the people who came, were in their early 20s. And they were saying, we're not thinking about fostering or adopting in the next few years, but we want to consider fostering or adopting alongside all our other options of starting a family later on in life. Now, we go to local authorities and tell them that story, and they're blown away, because at the moment, there's a shortfall of 7,000 foster carers in the UK, but most foster carers are in their 50s. Most foster carers will retire in the next 10 years. So the crisis that this country is going to face in 10 years' time is really, really serious. But isn't it fantastic that the church is now coming up and saying, we have got the next generation of foster carers in our midst ready for you to take children. Like, that is encouraging. So another story. How long have I got? Excellent. So another story. A just over 2 years ago, our founder and director, Krish Kandaya, was speaking at Momentum, a Christian festival for 20s, and a couple went to a session he was doing. It wasn't on adoption, but as Krish always does, if you've heard him speak anywhere, he will talk about fostering and adoption in some way, shape or form. And they left the seminar thinking, you know what, we were thinking about starting a birth family, but I think we should adopt. They didn't tell each other this. They went on holiday, they both downloaded the Home for Good book on their Kindle, and no joke, they're apparently sitting next door to each other on sun lounges, reading the Home for Good book, both thinking that God had told them to adopt, but too scared to tell the other one. It wasn't until they got back from holiday that they finally had the conversation, you know what, we should adopt. So they phoned the Home for Good inquiry line. We journeyed with them a little bit. We passed them on to one of our agencies because we're not a fostering and adoption agency ourselves. We pass people on, and when they're at that stage of the process, they began the process. And then last year, they welcomed 2 black girls into their family. So these 2 girls were considered harder to place because they're a sibling group and from a black minority ethnic group. Their church has been fantastic because it's a multi-ethnic church. So they've been getting loads of the cultural advice from other people within their church as well. These adopters have now gone on to champions to encourage other people in their area to foster and adopt. So that's just kind of a few stories. Let me introduce you now to what we call our kind of engagement pyramid. And this kind of begins to outline kind of our challenge because we are trying to take people on a journey through this pyramid. So at the top, we are engaging with the tens of thousands. So at festivals and churches, we are just inspiring people that and raising awareness that there's an issue and inspiring people to do something about it. So we're going to the tens of thousands of people. We hope that kind of thousands of those people will go to thinking, there's something I need to do. I will pray, I will give, I will sign a political petition or something, but there's something I can do to make a difference in the lives of vulnerable children. So that's the kind of the tens of thousands going to the thousands. We hope that then hundreds of people will begin to think, you know what, I could support families that foster and adopt. You know what, I can't do it myself, but I could do their ironing, I could do some babysitting, I could give them lifts, I could do a whole load of practical things. So we're hoping hundreds of people will kind of do that. And we're hoping that other hundreds of people will begin to think about that this could be something for them in the future. And then from that, we hope tens of people will go on to think about actually becoming foster carers or adopters themselves and begin the process of being assessed, going to training, and eventually welcoming children into their homes. So that's the tens. And then you kind of get to the ones, as it were, and we hope that people will go on to be champions within the Home for Good movement, that they will be so caught up in the idea that a movement within the church could provide a home for every child that needs one, that they would become a champion, and then in effect they would kind of go back up to the top here and begin helping Home for Good engage with the tens of thousands. So that's kind of what we call our kind of engagement pyramid, and as a kind of an organisation, we are trying to facilitate this kind of movement that's going on, and we're inspiring people, we're equipping people, and we're connecting people as they kind of go through this. But we kind of have lots and lots of problems within that. Like, we have some really good stuff going on, but there's also loads of problems, and we're hoping that technology might help us with some of those problems. So we're great at inspiring loads and loads of people, but the problem is people can go off and foster and adopt without telling us. So when someone asks us how many people are fostered or adopted because of Home for Good, we have not got a clue, because lots of people would just go to their local authority and do it. So unless we have a partnership with a particular local authority or agency, we never know. So we have partnerships with an agency in the Midlands, and we worked with them for a year and a half, and they only got 1 family from Home for Good. But the neighbouring agency, who we didn't work with, they got 6 families over the same kind of time period. So the agency helping fund us weren't too impressed with that. We think there's loads of ways We can add value to people on the journey. We do an inquiry line, but we don't know always where that goes. Sometimes you'll pass people onto an agency or a local authority to begin fostering or adopting. But local authorities are absolutely rubbish at feeding data back to us to let us know how that person is getting on. We connect people to buddies around the country, so our champions, we connect people to them, and that often starts off some great one-to-one conversations, but we don't always kind of hear back. We know that there's dozens of Home for Good inspired support groups around the country. We hear stories about them. We're in contact with about 40 of them, but we know there are more. So it's really frustrating when someone phones us and says, we are a foster carer in Birmingham, and we really want to be supported by other Christian foster carers. And we're like, we don't actually know exactly what's happening in Birmingham. We don't know who to connect you with. So it all seems kind of messy. And in one sense, we like that because we are a movement. We're trying to be more like a movement than an organisation. We don't want to kind of own these support groups, but we'd love to do a better job at connecting people to them. My time must be up.
Good job, well done. Any questions for Phil, Home for Good? Good round of applause for both. Questions just for Phil? Home for Good. Out the back here.
It's compulsory that I ask a prayer-related question as the person who runs Prayer Meet, but you mentioned trying to inspire people to pray for this problem. Do you produce any kind of resources to help people do that?
Not well, no. So our monthly emails would always include prayer points. We have a prayer page on our website. We do quite a lot of social media prayer points, that kind of thing. But nothing particularly programmatised beyond that.
Do you have any kind of facility for helping those who may be foster carers and need support but aren't a part of the church?
Really good question. So that depends on where you are in the country. So as an organisation, what we primarily do is equipping churches to support families that foster and adopt. So we know in Worcester, for example, there are churches in Worcester that support foster carers and adoptive parents from the wider community, not just from within the church. So there's a church in Worcester that basically has weekly ironing parties. So a group of kind of people from the church get together with a few ironing boards, and the foster carers and adopters bring all their ironing and have all the ironing done. And that's open to the whole community, not just from within the church. But it's very ad hoc around the country, and that's partly what frustrates us, because there isn't any kind of real tangible connection of what's going on around the country.
Any more out the back here?
Hi, just wondering how you use technology at the moment so far to help these things, because you've talked a little bit about this idea of how you'd want to solve knowing more about what's going on. Is there any way that you've used technology so far, and particularly in the world of like data science-y like things, is there anything that you've done?
So it's been relatively ad hoc, and it's not overly well connected at the moment. But over the last year, we have spent a lot of resources in investing in a CRM system. So we have now got a Salesforce-based system kind of at the heart of a lot of what we do, which is beginning to help. So kind of website is now connected better into our overall systems. Inquiry line, we are beginning to track people through the inquiry line. From a fundraising point of view, we're now a lot easily being able to track people's supporter journeys. So kind of there's beginnings, but nothing particularly comprehensive.
Okay, James has a question.
Cheers. I'm actually going to sneak in two. Question one, which is what one we had for the previous one, is your users kind of stuff. Do you know what their skill set is in terms of kind of like how they use technology? The second one is, you mentioned a lot about kind of the data you get from councils. What kind of data do you get from councils? Kind of what kind of, is that the same kind of, etc.?
Great. So first question. So generally speaking, our kind of user groups would have pretty good IT skills. In fact, more so than foster carers, broadly speaking. So foster care historically has been quite a working class kind of activity. And actually, you speak to some fostering agencies, and they would say a third of their foster carers are illiterate, which is kind of really quite high. However, actually, but the fact that our main audience is the church, and the church by and large is middle class, we're actually introducing a whole different type of foster carer into the system, which is really interesting because we're introducing foster carers who know their rights, who know how to access a lawyer. And all of these kind of things can be quite scary for some agencies who have been able to get away with a lot in years past. One of the interesting things, so our hypothesis is that a lot of foster carers and adopters avoid social media because there are so many pitfalls for foster carers and adopters, like they can't share photographs of their children in their care, and that can be really hard if all your other friends are constantly sharing photographs of their children, that some choose simply to disengage with it. So although Home for Good social media is a relatively successful tool at building community and engaging with our audience, we have a strong hunch that we're not engaging with a massive number of people because they choose to self-select remove. So local authority data is mixed. So like the data we ask to get is basically ones or zeros of where people are at in the process and whether they've dropped out. So in theory, it should be relatively straightforward because all adoption agencies and local authorities follow a similar process. Government collect those statistics to see how they're doing in terms of timeframes. So it should be relatively straightforward. It should be in existence. But it's absolute nightmare to get, and the number of phone calls we have to make to chase getting that data, which you'd have thought must be sitting there somewhere, is unbelievably complex.